Threatening me over dinner? Dante said with approval that was probably unwarranted. I'm starting to understand why your father had such difficulty controlling you. You're not wired for submission even when survival would suggest it's strategically advisable. Says the man who's apparently spent 5 years planning revenge against organization that destroyed his family instead of just accepting loss and moving on with his life, Isabella countered, setting down the knife she had indeed been gripping harder than necessary. We're both people who refuse to accept what we're supposed to accept. That's why this arrangement works. We understand each other's refusal to be sensible. The moving truck had barely pulled away from the curb when Isabella Russo decided that her new neighborhood was either aggressively wholesome or hiding something deeply sinister beneath its manicured lawns and tasteful exterior paint choices. The houses on Maple Ridge Drive were the kind of expensive but not ostentatious properties that suggested their owners had wealth but preferred discretion, each one maintaining careful distance from its neighbors through strategic landscaping and privacy hedges that somehow managed to look friendly rather than fortress-like. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear into comfortable anonymity, which was precisely what Isabella needed after spending 26 years as the daughter of Vincent Russo, a man whose name made grown men go pale and whose business interests were so thoroughly criminal that even mentioning them in polite company would get you immediately uninvited from every social function within a 50-mile radius. She'd left that life 3 years ago after witnessing her father torture a man who'd stolen from him, the screams echoing through their family estate while her mother sipped wine and pretended nothing unusual was happening in the basement. That had been the breaking point, not the first violence Isabella had witnessed, but definitely the moment when she'd understood with crystalline clarity that staying meant becoming complicit in atrocities she could no longer rationalize as just business, or necessary for family security. So she'd taken the inheritance from her maternal grandmother, money that was legitimately earned through boring investments rather than extortion and drug trafficking, and she'd run. Changed her name from Isabella Russo to Isabella Ross, moved across 3 states, enrolled in graduate school under her new identity, and spent 3 years building a life that had absolutely nothing to do with organized crime or the father who'd probably declared her dead rather than admitting his own daughter had rejected everything he stood for. The house she'd purchased was perfect for someone seeking fresh start. A charming 2-story colonial with bay windows and a small garden that the previous owners had maintained with the kind of obsessive attention that suggested they'd probably won neighborhood beautification awards. It was the kind of place where normal people lived normal lives, where the biggest drama probably involved homeowners association disputes about fence heights rather than territorial wars between criminal organizations. Isabella had fallen in love with it immediately, had signed the papers without even trying to negotiate the price because desperation made you financially reckless, and she'd been desperate for somewhere that felt safe enough to finally stop looking over her shoulder. She spent her first day unpacking the essentials, clothes, books, the embarrassingly extensive collection of houseplants she'd accumulated during graduate school because nurturing living things made her feel less like a monster's daughter. And by evening she'd decided that proper integration into suburban life required the kind of neighborly gesture that would announce her presence without seeming suspicious. Her mother, for all her moral failings, had been correct about one thing. Showing up with baked goods was the universal language of, "I'm harmless and you should trust me." Isabella spent the next morning baking 3 different varieties of cookies: chocolate chip because they were classic, snickerdoodle because they were sophisticated, and lemon because they were bright and non-threatening, and arranged them on plates she'd bought specifically for this purpose at a home goods store where the cashier had complimented her commitment to community building. By noon she was ready to launch Operation Become a Normal Suburban Resident, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that suggested she was approachable rather than trying too hard, her sundress casual enough to seem effortless but nice enough to indicate she respected her neighbor's time. The first house she approached belonged to a couple in their 50s who introduced themselves as Margaret and Tom Fletcher, their smiles warm but containing that particular breed of cautiousness that suggested they'd learned to be careful about newcomers. "How wonderful," Margaret said, accepting the cookies with the kind of enthusiasm that felt slightly performative. "We're so glad to have young people moving into the neighborhood. It's been quite stable here, very quiet, very safe. We're sure you'll love it." "I already do," Isabella replied with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who'd spent 3 years living in increasingly terrible apartments while waiting for her grandmother's estate to clear probate. "Everyone seems so friendly. Though I noticed the house across the street from mine looks empty. I was thinking I should bring them cookies too once they move in." The temperature in the conversation dropped about 15 degrees, Margaret and Tom exchanging glances that communicated entire paragraphs worth of information Isabella couldn't quite decode. "Oh," Margaret said carefully, her smile becoming fixed in ways that suggested this was well-practiced response to uncomfortable questions. That house. Well, dear, our advice would be to simply not worry about that property. The owner values his privacy very much. It's best to just let that house be. We all do. It's neighborhood policy, you might say. Neighborhood policy not to welcome someone? Isabella asked, her curiosity immediately piqued by the obvious evasion. That seems a bit unfriendly. Is the owner difficult or something? Not difficult exactly, Tom interjected, his voice carrying warning that was probably meant to be subtle but came across as urgent. Just private. Very private. None of us interact with that house. We don't knock on the door, we don't leave mail if it's misdelivered, we certainly don't go inside. And honestly, Miss Ross, you'd be wise to follow the same policy. Some neighbors prefer to be left completely alone, and this particular neighbor has made his preferences abundantly clear. It was the kind of warning that would have been ominous if delivered with grave seriousness, but Tom's tone carried more nervousness than menace, like he was more afraid of the house's owner than concerned about Isabella's welfare. She thanked them for the advice with promises to respect everyone's boundaries, but internally she was already planning how to investigate the mysterious house that inspired such careful avoidance from otherwise friendly suburbanites. The pattern repeated at the next 3 houses she visited: warm welcomes that immediately cooled when she mentioned the house across from hers, carefully worded warnings about respecting privacy, subtle suggestions that she should forget that house existed and focus on literally any other property in the neighborhood. By the time Isabella returned home with significantly fewer cookies than she'd started with, she was thoroughly convinced that whatever was happening with the mysterious house was considerably more interesting than simple preference for solitude. She spent the next 2 days conducting surveillance that would have made her father proud if he'd known about it, though her methods were considerably less sophisticated than the professional-grade equipment Vincent Russo's organization employed. Isabella positioned herself by her bay window with a book she wasn't actually reading, noting the complete absence of any activity around the house that supposedly had an owner who valued privacy. No cars came or went. No lights turned on as evening fell. No sounds emanated from the property despite Isabella's bedroom window being close enough that she should have heard something if anyone was actually living there. It wasn't just empty, it was unnaturally still, like a stage set waiting for actors who'd never arrive. The lawn was maintained but showed no evidence of recent work. The mailbox remained closed despite 2 days of postal delivery. Even the birds seemed to avoid landing on that particular roof, which was probably Isabella's paranoia manifesting as ornithological conspiracy theories but still felt significant in ways she couldn't quite articulate. On the 3rd night, Isabella was considering whether her obsession with the mystery house suggested she needed therapy more urgently than she'd thought when movement finally disrupted the stillness. A figure emerged from the side door, male, tall, wearing dark hoodie that obscured his features, moving with the kind of fluid confidence that suggested familiarity with the property rather than someone breaking in. He walked to a black SUV parked in the shadows, his body language projecting the casual authority of someone who owned everything he surveyed and expected no challenges to that ownership. Isabella watched him drive away, her heart hammering with combination of vindication and renewed curiosity. Someone did live there. Someone who apparently operated entirely at night and preferred that the neighborhood believe his house was vacant. The obvious explanation was that he was conducting illegal activities that required secrecy, which should have made Isabella immediately back off given her very valid reasons for avoiding anything criminal. But 3 years of living cautiously had apparently exhausted her capacity for sensible self-preservation, because instead of heeding the warning signs, Isabella found herself planning how to actually meet the mysterious neighbor who'd inspired such careful avoidance from everyone else on Maple Ridge Drive. She spent the following morning cooking a pot roast, the kind of comfort food that suggested warmth and harmlessness, that communicated, "I'm just a friendly neighbor who definitely isn't investigating whether you're running some kind of criminal operation from your suspiciously empty house." By noon the roast was ready, smelling like domesticity incarnate, and Isabella had dressed in jeans and a casual sweater that struck the perfect balance between approachable and respectably put together. The walk across the street felt longer than it should have, her pulse accelerating with each step that brought her closer to violating the neighborhood's unspoken rule about leaving that house completely alone. Isabella climbed the porch steps with pot roast in hand, knocked firmly on the door with more confidence than she felt, and waited for response that didn't come. She knocked again, louder, and when silence continued she tried the doorknob with the rationalization that maybe he couldn't hear her knocking and she was just being helpful by checking if he was home. The door swung open easily, unlocked, which seemed like terrible security for someone who valued privacy enough to terrify his neighbors into pretending he didn't exist, and Isabella found herself stepping into entryway that was considerably less furnished than she'd expected. The living room visible beyond held exactly 3 pieces of furniture: a leather couch that looked expensive, a side table supporting a laptop, and a coffee table absolutely buried under stacks of files and papers arranged in neat piles that suggested organizational system rather than chaos. "Hello," Isabella called out, her voice echoing through the mostly empty house in ways that made the space feel more abandoned than actively inhabited. "I'm your neighbor from across the street. I brought you food because apparently I'm the only person in this neighborhood who hasn't received the memo about leaving you alone, which probably says concerning things about my decision-making skills, but here we are anyway." No response came, but Isabella's attention had been captured by the papers on the coffee table, their presence suggesting recent activity despite the house's general air of abandonment. She moved closer, her curiosity overriding the voice in her head that sounded disturbingly like her father warning that snooping in other people's business was how you ended up dead in unfortunate accidents. The top file was labeled with a company name she didn't recognize, its contents appearing to be financial records or surveillance data or possibly both. "What exactly are you doing in my house?" a voice asked from behind her, calm and controlled in ways that made Isabella's heart stop completely before resuming at approximately triple its normal rate. She spun around to find a man standing in the doorway that presumably led to the rest of the house, and her brain immediately short-circuited trying to process multiple pieces of information simultaneously. First, he was striking in ways that made handsome seem like inadequate description, his features sharp and symmetrical with the kind of bone structure that suggested excellent genetics and possibly some distant Mediterranean ancestry. Second, he was fresh from the shower, water still dripping from dark hair that fell across his forehead, a towel wrapped around his waist and hanging low enough that Isabella could see the distinct V of muscle disappearing beneath terry cloth. Third, his chest was a topographical map of muscle definition that suggested either religious devotion to fitness or the kind of physical labor that built functional strength rather than aesthetic bulk. Isabella started, her mouth apparently having forgotten how to form coherent sentences while her eyes were busy cataloging the stranger's physical attributes. "I brought you pot roast. Because I'm your neighbor. And apparently no one else brings you anything because they're all terrified of you for reasons they won't specify, which made me curious rather than cautious because my self-preservation instincts are clearly defective." "That explains your presence on my porch," the man replied, his voice carrying the kind of educated accent that suggested expensive schools and cultured upbringing, which didn't quite match the intimidation factor he apparently projected to his neighbors. "It doesn't explain why you're currently standing in my living room reading confidential documents while I was in the shower. That seems significantly more intrusive than simple neighborly friendliness." "The door was unlocked," Isabella said defensively, finally managing to tear her eyes away from his chest and focus on his face, which didn't actually help her concentration because his eyes were the kind of dark brown that looked almost black in certain lighting and suggested he saw considerably more than most people preferred to have visible. "I knocked and no one answered, so I thought maybe you couldn't hear me and I was just checking if anyone was home before leaving the pot roast on your porch where it would attract animals and create exactly the kind of neighborhood drama I'm trying to avoid." "So your response to an unlocked door was to walk inside and start reading private documents?" The man's eyebrow raised with what might have been amusement or possibly incredulity at her audacity. "That's a bold interpretation of appropriate neighbor behavior. Most people would have left the pot roast and departed. But you're not most people, are you, Isabella?" The use of her name made Isabella's blood run cold, her survival instincts finally engaging now that her brain had stopped being distracted by abs that belonged in fitness magazines. "How do you know my name? I haven't introduced myself. We've never met." "Unless you've been," she stopped, her eyes drifting past him to the wall behind where he stood, and her sentence died completely as she registered what was displayed there. Photographs. Dozens of them, arranged in neat rows with the kind of organizational precision that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual interest. Maps with locations marked in red. Schedules printed in small font. Lists of names and addresses. And prominently featured among all the intelligence-gathering materials were multiple photos of Isabella herself, sitting by her bay window with her book, carrying groceries from her car, watering her garden that first morning after moving in. But it was the newest photo that made Isabella's stomach drop through the floor. A shot of her in her bedroom taken from an angle that could only have come from inside her own house, her face clearly visible in the lamplight as she'd been reading before bed just 2 nights ago. "You've been watching me," Isabella whispered, the pot roast slipping from nerveless fingers to crash on the hardwood floor with sound that seemed obscenely loud in the sudden tension. "You've been inside my house. Taking pictures while oh my God, you're exactly the kind of dangerous creep my neighbors were warning me about, and I just walked directly into your completely empty house like the world's stupidest horror movie victim. If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be hurt," the man replied with matter-of-fact calmness that was somehow more terrifying than overt threats would have been. The surveillance wasn't about causing harm. It was about confirming identity and assessing threat level. Which brings us to the much more interesting question than why I've been watching you. Why is Vincent Russo's daughter living under a false name in a house she purchased with money traced back to legitimate inheritance? What exactly are you running from, Isabella? Or should I call you by your real surname, Russo? The world tilted sideways as Isabella processed that this stranger, this dangerous, half-naked stranger who'd been conducting surveillance on her for God knew how long, knew exactly who her father was, knew she'd changed her name, knew details about her life that should have been impossible to discover if her identity change had been as thorough as she'd believed. Her knees went weak with terror that was rapidly morphing into fury, because being afraid was exhausting and Isabella had spent 3 years being afraid of her father finding her, and she was absolutely done with powerful men thinking they could terrify her into submission. "Who the hell are you?" Isabella demanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline making her hands shake. "And why is Vincent Russo's criminal organization apparently so interesting that you've been stalking his estranged daughter like some kind of demented private investigator? Because let me be very clear about something. I left that life. I want nothing to do with my father or his business or anyone who's stupid enough to get involved with either. So if you're planning to use me as leverage against him, I have bad news about how much he values family members who've publicly rejected everything he stands for." "I'm not planning to use you as leverage," the man replied, moving toward her with the kind of predatory grace that made Isabella instinctively step backward despite her attempts to project confidence. "At least not in the way you're imagining. Though I am curious why you think walking into my house uninvited entitles you to demand explanations. You're the one who violated boundaries, Isabella. I'm simply responding to intruder with considerably more courtesy than the situation warrants." "Courtesy?" Isabella's voice rose with incredulity that overrode her fear. "You've been taking pictures of me in my own bedroom and you're calling this courtesy? I'm calling the police. Right now. I don't care what connection you have to my father or why you think surveillance is acceptable. I'm not dealing with this stalker nonsense without involving actual law enforcement." She grabbed for her phone, but the man moved faster than she'd anticipated, his hand closing around her wrist with grip that was firm without being painful, his body suddenly very close to hers in ways that made her aware of how much larger and stronger he was. "I wouldn't recommend involving police," he said quietly, his voice dropping to register that made Isabella's pulse accelerate for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Because explaining why Vincent Russo's daughter is living under false identity might raise questions you're not prepared to answer. Questions about whether you're actually estranged from your father or if this is elaborate cover for some scheme he's planning. Questions that would make your carefully constructed new life considerably more complicated than it needs to be." "Let go of me," Isabella said through gritted teeth, her free hand coming up to shove at his very bare, very muscular chest in futile attempt to create distance. "Or I swear to God I will scream loudly enough that every neighbor on this street will come running, and I don't care what explanations I have to give if it means getting away from whatever this situation is turning into." For a moment they stood frozen in tense standoff, Isabella's hand pressed against warm skin still damp from the shower, the stranger's grip on her wrist unbreakable but not tightening, their faces close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes and smell whatever expensive soap he'd used that made him smell like cedar and something darker she couldn't identify. Then his expression shifted to something that might have been resignation or possibly tactical recalculation. "You're right," he said, releasing her wrist and stepping back to restore safe distance between them. "This isn't how this conversation should be happening. I apologize for the surveillance, it was necessary for confirming your identity but I understand why it feels violating. Let me start over with actual introduction. My name is Dante Caruso. And you're currently standing in the house I rented specifically to monitor Vincent Russo's daughter after I learned she'd purchased property in this neighborhood. So technically we're both here because of your father. The question is whether you're going to run screaming back to your house, or whether you're curious enough about why I've been watching you to stay and hear the explanation that will probably either terrify you or make you my unlikely ally." Isabella stood frozen, her mind racing through implications while her body apparently remained interested in the fact that Dante Caruso looked like he'd walked out of some kind of dangerous men calendar despite currently wearing only a towel. "That's not actually a choice," she managed finally, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. Those are both terrible options. I pick secret option 3, I leave right now, you forget I exist, and we both pretend this deeply disturbing encounter never happened. You won't forget, Dante replied with certainty that was either arrogant or based on accurate assessment of her personality. You're too curious. It's written all over your face. You want to know why I'm watching you, what I know about your father, why I've gone to such elaborate lengths to position myself across from your house. And Isabella? His voice dropped. You should want to know. Because the reason I'm here? It concerns threats to your safety that you're apparently completely unaware of despite having very valid reasons to be paranoid about your father's reach. That stopped her. Stopped her completely. Because Dante was right, she was curious, desperately so, and the mention of threats she didn't know about made her survival instincts scream that running would be temporary safety while staying might provide information that could actually keep her alive long-term. It was the same calculation that had made her leave her father's house instead of pretending everything was fine. Sometimes you had to do the terrifying thing to avoid the catastrophic thing. 5 minutes, Isabella said finally, her arms crossing defensively across her chest. You have 5 minutes to explain who you are, why you're stalking me, and what threats I'm supposedly unaware of. And Dante? If your explanation involves trying to recruit me for some kind of scheme against my father, or if you're actually working for him and this is an elaborate test of my loyalty, or if you're just a regular stalker who happened to get lucky finding out my real identity, I'm walking out that door and we're going to have serious problems that probably involve me filing police reports that will make both our lives very complicated. Fair terms, Dante agreed, and his smile when it appeared was dangerous and charming in equal measure. Though I should warn you, my explanation is going to take considerably longer than 5 minutes. And you're going to want to sit down for parts of it. But since you walked into my house uninvited, since you've already seen the surveillance materials, since we're apparently past the point of maintaining comfortable fictions about privacy and boundaries, let me show you exactly why Vincent Russo's daughter is the most important person in my current operations. He moved toward the wall covered in surveillance photos, and Isabella found herself following despite every instinct screaming that she should run. Because he was right about one thing, she was desperately curious. And that curiosity was probably going to get her killed, but at least she'd die knowing exactly what kind of danger she'd walked into when she decided that bringing pot roast to the mysterious neighbor was appropriate suburban behavior. The next hour of her life, Isabella suspected, was going to be either revelatory or absolutely catastrophic. Possibly both simultaneously. And she still didn't know whether to be more concerned about the surveillance photos or the fact that Dante Caruso looked unfairly attractive while discussing her father's criminal organization. Her priorities, Isabella reflected grimly, might need some serious examination. Isabella's 5-minute deadline extended into 20 and then 45 as Dante methodically explained the surveillance materials spread across his living room, his voice maintaining clinical detachment that suggested he'd delivered similar briefings countless times before. He'd put on clothes at some point, black jeans and a dark gray t-shirt that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less, though Isabella was trying very hard not to notice because focusing on his appearance while he was explaining threats to her life seemed like exactly the kind of poor judgment that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. Your father has been consolidating power aggressively for the past 18 months, Dante said, pointing to a map marked with red pins indicating territories. He's absorbed 3 rival organizations, eliminated 4 competitors who refused to negotiate surrender, and established himself as the dominant force in trafficking operations across 6 states. But consolidation creates vulnerability. The more territory you control, the more enemies you accumulate, and Vincent has made a lot of enemies. Some of whom have decided that targeting his estranged daughter would be an effective way to damage his reputation or leverage his cooperation. Except he doesn't care about me, Isabella interrupted, her voice bitter with the kind of pain that came from having already accepted a truth most people spent lifetimes denying. I left 3 years ago. He didn't come looking for me. Didn't try to bring me back or even send threatening messages about family loyalty. I'm dead to him. He made that very clear through his complete silence. So anyone thinking they can use me as leverage fundamentally misunderstands our relationship. Are you sure about that? Dante's expression suggested he knew something Isabella didn't, and she hated how much that made her stomach clench with unwanted hope that maybe her father had cared more than his silence indicated. Because my intelligence suggests otherwise. Vincent put considerable resources into ensuring your identity change was thorough and untraceable. He had people monitoring your graduate school enrollment, making sure no one connected Isabella Ross to the Russo family. He's been maintaining what I'd call protective surveillance, Distant enough that you weren't aware of it, but active enough that anyone trying to find you through him would hit carefully constructed dead ends. The revelation hit Isabella like physical blow, her worldview reorganizing itself around information that suggested her father's silence hadn't been abandonment but protection, that maybe walking away hadn't meant severing all ties but simply creating safe distance between his violence and her attempts at normal life. That doesn't make sense, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. If he cared about protecting me, why not just, actually communicate that? Why let me spend 3 years thinking he'd written me off completely? Because Vincent Russo's version of love is toxic and possessive and generally causes more damage than genuine care would, Dante replied with casual brutality that suggested extensive personal experience with her father's personality. He protects you by maintaining distance while simultaneously ensuring no one else can reach you. It's control disguised as freedom. And it means that anyone wanting to hurt him through you has to work considerably harder than simply kidnapping the estranged daughter. They have to get through protective surveillance you didn't even know existed. Isabella moved to sit on the leather couch before her knees could give out entirely, her mind working through implications that made her 3 years of assumed safety feel suddenly precarious. So I've been living under protection I didn't want from a father I rejected, while apparently accumulating enemies who think targeting me would be strategically valuable. That's just fantastic. Exactly the fresh start I was hoping for. And you? She looked up at Dante. Where do you fit into this deeply messed up situation? Are you one of the people trying to use me as leverage? Is that what all this surveillance has been about? I'm considerably more complicated than simple enemy of your father, Dante said, and something in his expression made Isabella's breath catch with recognition that she was missing crucial pieces of information. Though I suppose enemy is accurate enough as shorthand. My name is Dante Caruso. And before you ask whether that surname should mean something to you, yes, it should. My family controlled the same territories your father currently claims. Past tense, because Vincent absorbed our organization 5 years ago through combination of violence and strategic betrayals that left most of my family dead and me with a very long list of people who need to answer for what they took from us. The temperature in the room dropped approximately 20 degrees as Isabella processed that she wasn't sitting across from random criminal interested in leverage but from someone with direct personal vendetta against her father, someone whose family had been destroyed by Vincent Russo's consolidation of power. You're planning revenge, she said flatly, her survival instincts finally engaging now that the danger was explicit rather than implied. That's what all of this is about. The surveillance, the house across from mine, the monitoring of my movements. You're using me to get to my father. And I'm betting the explanation you promised about threats to my safety was really just preamble to telling me how you plan to use me as bait or leverage or whatever role you've decided I'll play in your revenge scheme. Actually, my plan was considerably more straightforward than that, Dante replied with calmness that was more unsettling than anger would have been. I was going to kidnap you, hold you in secure location where your father's protective surveillance couldn't reach, and use you as leverage to force Vincent into exposed position where I could eliminate him and reclaim the territory his organization stole from my family. Simple, direct, effective. The surveillance was about confirming your daily patterns and identifying optimal moment to grab you without triggering alerts. Isabella was on her feet before conscious thought could stop her, adrenaline flooding her system with fight-or-flight response that made her hands shake and her vision narrow. Well, thank you for the advance warning, she said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. I'll be sure to install better locks and maybe invest in security system before you decide to implement your simple, direct kidnapping plan. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to leave before this conversation gets even more disturbing, and then I'm going to seriously consider whether moving to another country might be advisable. She made it 3 steps toward the door before Dante moved, his hand catching her arm with grip that was firm enough to stop her momentum but careful enough not to hurt. I said that was my plan, he clarified, his body suddenly very close to hers in ways that made Isabella's pulse accelerate for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Past tense. Before I actually observed you for 2 weeks and realized that kidnapping Vincent Russo's daughter would make me exactly the kind of monster I've been trying not to become while pursuing justice for my family. You're not part of his organization. You genuinely rejected everything he stands for. And using you as leverage would punish the wrong person for your father's sins. So your conscience stopped you from kidnapping me, Isabella said, her voice dripping with sarcasm that was easier than acknowledging the relief flooding through her. How wonderfully ethical of you. I'm sure that makes the surveillance and the invasion of my privacy and the general stalker behavior totally acceptable. Should I be grateful that you decided not to traumatize me for crimes my father committed? You should be pragmatic, Dante countered, his eyes holding hers with intensity that made looking away feel impossible. Because while I've decided not to use you as leverage, other people haven't reached the same conclusion. There are at least 3 organizations I'm aware of who are planning to grab you within the next month. Your father's protective surveillance has kept them at distance so far, but they're getting bolder, more desperate. And if one of them succeeds, if you're taken by people who don't have my extremely recent moral qualms about targeting innocent family members, you'll wish I'd kidnapped you first, because at least I have boundaries about what I'm willing to do to prisoners. The threat assessment was delivered with such matter-of-fact calmness that Isabella's fear crystallized into something approaching fury. So my options are: get kidnapped by you and used as leverage despite your supposed moral evolution, get kidnapped by someone worse than you who'll do God knows what to force my father's cooperation, or continue living in ignorant false security while unknown enemies plan my abduction. Those are terrible options. All 3 of them are terrible. I'm not accepting any of them. Then what's your alternative? Dante asked, releasing her arm but not stepping back, his proximity making rational thought considerably more difficult than it should have been. You can't go to your father for protection without acknowledging the connection you've spent 3 years trying to sever. You can't go to police because explaining why you need protection means revealing your real identity and probably triggering investigations you'd prefer to avoid. You can't run again because now that multiple organizations know where you are, they'll follow. So unless you have secret option 4 that I'm not seeing, you're going to need to accept help from someone. And Isabella, his voice dropped. I'm offering to be that someone. Not as kidnapper. As protector. Come to my actual home, not the surveillance house but my real residence, and let me keep you safe while I dismantle the threats targeting you. In exchange, you provide information about your father's organization that will help me achieve my goals without requiring me to use you as leverage. It was sales pitch delivered with the kind of persuasive intensity that suggested Dante had spent significant time perfecting his negotiation skills, but Isabella's bullshit detector, finely honed through 26 years of watching her father manipulate people, was screaming warnings about exactly how voluntary this offer actually was. That's not protection, she said flatly. That's kidnapping with extra steps and prettier justification. You're still taking me somewhere controlled by you, still using me to achieve goals against my father, still fundamentally treating me as asset rather than person. The only difference is you're asking permission first, which I suppose makes you marginally less terrible than the alternatives but doesn't actually make this arrangement acceptable. You're right, Dante admitted, and the surprise of his agreement made Isabella's carefully constructed argument stumble. It is kidnapping with extra steps. But it's also your best chance of surviving the next month without ending up in considerably worse situations. And Isabella? His hand came up to cup her face with gentleness that completely contradicted his threat assessment briefing. I'm not your father. I'm not going to hurt you or use you without consent or treat you as disposable asset. I'm offering genuine protection in exchange for cooperation that doesn't require you to violate whatever ethical boundaries you've established about your father's organization. You'll be safe. You'll be treated with respect. And when the immediate threats are neutralized, you'll be free to return to your life with better security than you currently have. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. Isabella should have left it. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that accepting Dante's offer was exactly the kind of decision that led to newspaper headlines about women who'd mysteriously disappeared after trusting dangerous men. But she was also pragmatic enough to recognize that her alternatives were limited and potentially catastrophic. And at least Dante was being honest about his motivations rather than pretending this was simple neighborly concern. If I agree, she said carefully, her mind already working through implications and exit strategies, I want actual parameters. Not vague promises about safety and respect, but specific boundaries about what cooperation means and what happens if I decide this arrangement isn't working. Because Dante, she stepped back from his touch, creating physical distance that made thinking slightly easier. I've spent 3 years building life independent of powerful men who think they know what's best for me. I'm not trading my father's control for yours just because you're slightly more honest about your manipulations. Fair demands, Dante agreed, and his smile when it appeared was appreciative rather than condescending. Here are my terms. You'll stay at my primary residence where security is sufficient to prevent kidnapping attempts. You'll provide information about your father's organization, specifically about his trafficking operations and the protection networks he's built, that will help me dismantle those aspects of his business without requiring direct confrontation that would put you at risk. You'll have freedom to move within secured parameters, privacy in your personal space, and my guarantee that if you want to leave after threats are neutralized, I'll provide resources to help you relocate somewhere even your father's surveillance can't easily reach. In exchange, I get your cooperation and your agreement not to warn Vincent that his daughter is currently residing with his enemy. Those are my terms. Negotiate if you want different ones. It was more reasonable than Isabella had expected. The boundaries clear enough that she could identify specific points of negotiation rather than dealing with vague promises that could be reinterpreted at convenience. I want communication access, she countered immediately, her mind cataloging priorities. Not monitored calls to my father, obviously, but ability to contact friends and maintain my graduate school enrollment without raising suspicions about my absence. I want written agreement about the information sharing boundaries. Specifically, I won't provide anything that would directly endanger individuals who aren't involved in trafficking or violent crimes. And I want your guarantee that if I identify threats to innocent people in my father's organization, you'll help extract them rather than treating them as acceptable collateral damage. Ambitious negotiator, Dante observed, but his expression held respect rather than irritation. I can agree to monitored communication access that won't compromise security. I can provide written boundaries about information sharing, though I reserve right to ask questions even if you choose not to answer them. And I'll help extract innocent people from your father's organization if they're genuinely innocent and if extraction won't compromise larger operations. But Isabella, you need to understand that innocent, in this context, has limited meaning. Most people in Vincent's organization have made choices that put them there. Helping them means they need to actively want out, not just that you've decided they deserve rescue. Agreed, Isabella said, because that was fair boundary even if she didn't like how it limited her ability to help people who might be trapped by circumstances. One more condition. If I find out you've lied to me about your intentions, if you use me as leverage against my father after promising not to, if you treat me as prisoner rather than protected guest, I want your word that you'll let me leave immediately with enough resources to disappear somewhere you can't find me. Because Dante, I'm taking enormous risk trusting you based on one conversation and surveillance photos that prove you're capable of significant invasion of privacy. I need to know there's exit strategy if this arrangement turns out to be exactly the trap my instincts are warning me it might be. Dante was silent for a long moment, his expression suggesting he was processing something more complex than simple negotiation. You have my word, he said finally, his voice carrying weight that suggested genuine oath rather than convenient promise. If I violate the terms we're establishing, if I use you in ways you haven't consented to, if this arrangement becomes imprisonment rather than protection, I'll personally ensure you have resources to disappear more thoroughly than your current identity change accomplished. That's my guarantee, Isabella. And unlike your father, when I give my word about something that matters, I keep it. The comparison to her father was calculated to manipulate her agreement, but Isabella found herself believing him anyway because something in Dante's expression suggested he understood exactly what it meant to have your trust violated by someone who was supposed to protect you. Okay, she heard herself saying, the word emerging before she'd fully processed the decision. I'll come to your residence. I'll cooperate with information sharing within the boundaries we've established. But Dante, she met his eyes directly. If this goes wrong, if you turn out to be just another powerful man who thinks control equals care, I will make you regret underestimating exactly how much damage Vincent Russo's daughter learned about revenge by watching her father destroy people who crossed him. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, Dante replied, and his smile was dangerous and admiring in equal measure. Though I should warn you, threatening me with revenge is significantly more appealing than you probably intended. I do enjoy a woman who can articulate specific consequences for betrayal. It suggests we're going to have very interesting conversations once you're settled in my home and we're not conducting negotiations in surveillance house with pot roast splattered across the floor. Isabella looked down at the forgotten pot roast, its presence suddenly absurd given how dramatically the situation had escalated from friendly neighbor gesture to voluntary pseudo-kidnapping. I'm going to need to pack, she said, forcing her mind back to practical concerns before she could reconsider the monumentally stupid decision she just made. And I should probably leave note for my neighbors explaining why I'm suddenly absent, though I'm not sure what plausible excuse doesn't sound like I've been kidnapped by the mysterious neighbor everyone warned me about. Family emergency, Dante suggested immediately. Your grandmother's estate has complications requiring your presence across the country for indefinite period. It explains sudden absence without raising alarm, and it's close enough to truth that you won't have to maintain complex lies if questioned later. I'll have my people monitor your house to ensure it stays secure while you're gone, and we can maintain appearance of normal residence through strategic light timers and periodic lawn maintenance. The fact that he'd already planned cover story suggested Dante had been confident Isabella would accept his offer, which should have irritated her but instead just reinforced that she was dealing with someone who planned thoroughly rather than improvising. "How long do I have to pack?" she asked, accepting that she'd crossed the point of no return and trying to focus on logistics rather than existential crisis about her judgment. "1 hour," Dante replied, checking his watch with casual efficiency. "Pack essentials and anything you can't replace. I'll have people collect remaining belongings later if you decide you want them." "And Isabella?" His hand caught hers before she could move toward the door. "Thank you for trusting me despite having every reason not to. I won't waste that trust." "You better not," Isabella said, squeezing his hand briefly before pulling away. "Because if this goes badly, I'm haunting you in the afterlife in ways that will make any Catholic guilt you're carrying look like pleasant meditation. Now let me go pack before I panic about what I've just agreed to and change my mind entirely." She left the surveillance house and crossed back to her own property, her legs feeling distinctly unsteady despite her attempts to project confidence. 1 hour to pack her life and commit to staying with dangerous man who'd been surveilling her for weeks. 1 hour to fundamentally alter her circumstances based on threat assessment from someone who admitted he'd originally planned to kidnap her. It was possibly the worst decision Isabella had ever made, which was saying something given her history of questionable judgment. But it was also the only decision that gave her any agency over what came next, and agency felt valuable enough to risk trusting someone who might be exactly as dangerous as her father, just aimed in different direction. An hour later, Isabella found herself in passenger seat of Dante's black SUV, her belongings packed in trunk, her house secured with automated systems that would maintain appearance of occupancy. They drove in silence through streets that went from suburban comfort to increasingly isolated rural roads, the city lights fading behind them until they were surrounded by darkness punctuated only by occasional security lights marking the boundary of Dante's property. His residence turned out to be an estate that made Isabella's father's compound look modest by comparison. Sprawling mansion set back from the road behind gates that probably cost more than most people's houses, surrounded by grounds that were either meticulously landscaped or naturally beautiful in ways that seemed improbable. The security was subtle but unmistakable, cameras positioned at strategic intervals, guards dressed in casual clothes that didn't quite hide the weapons they carried, defensive architecture disguised as aesthetic choices. This wasn't safe house. This was fortress designed to look like a home. "Welcome to your temporary residence," Dante said as they pulled up to the main entrance. "I know it's intimidating. Most people find the security excessive until they've spent a few days understanding exactly what threats we're defending against. But Isabella?" He turned to look at her directly. "You're safe here. Genuinely safe. No one gets through these defenses without me knowing about it, and no one touches you without facing consequences they won't survive. That's my guarantee." "You're very confident about your security," Isabella observed, trying to project calm while internally cataloging every exit route and defensive position she could identify. "I hope it's warranted. Because if someone does get through and your confidence was misplaced, I'm going to be very annoyed about dying because you underestimated your enemies." "I don't underestimate enemies," Dante replied, his tone suggesting genuine conviction rather than empty bravado. "I've spent 5 years preparing for exactly this kind of operation. Every weakness has been addressed. Every vulnerability secured. You're safer here than you've been anywhere since leaving your father's protection." He might have been right. The security certainly suggested resources and planning that went beyond simple paranoia. But as Isabella followed Dante into the mansion, as she was shown to guest suite that was larger and more luxurious than her entire previous apartment, as she processed that she'd just voluntarily entered the home of a man who'd admitted planning to kidnap her, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that she'd just traded one form of captivity for another. Even if this particular captor looked unfairly good in casual clothes and seemed genuinely concerned about her safety. Her judgment, Isabella reflected as she unpacked a room that came with its own bathroom and sitting area, really needed serious examination. But at least she was still alive to examine it. That had to count for something. The first week at Dante's estate passed in surreal suspension of normalcy, Isabella adjusting to life in gilded cage that was simultaneously more comfortable and more restrictive than anything she'd experienced even in her father's house. The mansion was beautiful in ways that suggested someone with actual taste had designed it rather than simply spending money until the result looked expensive. The grounds were extensive enough that Isabella could walk for an hour without hitting the property boundaries, and the staff were uniformly polite in ways that suggested they'd been carefully trained to treat her as honored guest rather than prisoner despite everyone being aware of exactly what her presence here actually represented. Dante himself was unexpectedly good company, his personality containing depths that surveillance photos hadn't captured. He was sharp-witted and genuinely funny when he wasn't delivering threat assessments, his conversations ranging from high culture to completely ridiculous tangents with equal ease, and he had the kind of self-awareness about his own intensity that made his dangerous aspects feel less threatening and more like character traits that could be managed with appropriate caution. "You're staring," Dante observed one evening when they were having dinner in the more casual dining room that apparently existed because the formal one was unnecessarily intimidating for regular meals. "I'm trying to decide if that's because you've finally recognized how devastatingly handsome I am, or if you're calculating exactly how much force would be required to stab me with that dinner knife you've been gripping for the past 5 minutes. Can't it be both?" Isabella replied, her tone dry enough that Dante actually laughed, a genuine sound that made him look younger and less weighted by whatever darkness he carried from his family's destruction. "I'm a complex woman capable of appreciating aesthetics while simultaneously planning defensive violence. It's called multitasking." "Threatening me over dinner?" Dante said with approval that was probably unwarranted. "I'm starting to understand why your father had such difficulty controlling you. You're not wired for submission even when survival would suggest it's strategically advisable," says the man who's apparently spent 5 years planning revenge against organization that destroyed his family instead of just accepting loss and moving on with his life, Isabella countered, setting down the knife she had indeed been gripping harder than necessary. "We're both people who refuse to accept what we're supposed to accept. That's why this arrangement works. We understand each other's refusal to be sensible." The observation hung between them with weight that suggested they were both processing something more significant than casual conversation. Dante set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious in ways that made Isabella's pulse accelerate despite weeks of building trust. "You want to know something I haven't told you yet?" he asked quietly. "About why I changed my plan from kidnapping you to protecting you?" "I assumed your conscience finally caught up with your revenge planning," Isabella replied, trying for lightness despite genuine curiosity about what had changed Dante's mind. "Or possibly you recognized that kidnapping someone tends to make them significantly less cooperative when you eventually need their help." "It was the way you watered your plants," Dante said, and the specificity of the statement made Isabella's breath catch with surprise. "That first morning after you moved in, I was watching through your window with the kind of professional detachment I'd maintained through weeks of surveillance, and you were watering your houseplants with this expression of such concentrated care. Like each plant was individual being deserving of personal attention rather than just generic green thing that needed water. And I realized, anyone who cares that much about keeping living things alive isn't someone who deserves to be used as leverage in revenge scheme. You're not extension of your father. You're a person who's built entire life around being nothing like him. And treating you as tool to hurt him would make me exactly the monster he is." The confession was delivered with such raw honesty that Isabella felt something in her chest crack open despite her careful maintenance of emotional boundaries. "That's," she stopped, searching for words adequate to respond to someone whose moral awakening had apparently been triggered by her plant watering routine. "That's possibly the weirdest and most touching thing anyone has ever said to me. Though I should point out that keeping houseplants alive is fairly low bar for human decency. I'd hope it takes more than basic botanical care to prove someone doesn't deserve kidnapping." "You'd be surprised how low my standards had dropped after 5 years of revenge planning," Dante replied, but his expression held something vulnerable that suggested this conversation mattered more than his casual tone indicated. "I'd convinced myself that collateral damage was acceptable if it achieved larger goals, that using innocent people was justified if they were connected to guilty ones, that the ends would somehow retroactively excuse the means. Watching you exist so deliberately separate from your father's violence, it reminded me why I started this in the first place. It wasn't supposed to be about becoming the same kind of monster that destroyed my family. It was supposed to be about justice." "Justice is complicated," Isabella said carefully, because she understood exactly how seductive revenge could be while also knowing how easily it devoured people who pursued it. "Especially when the people you're seeking justice against are as entrenched and dangerous as my father's organization. Are you sure you want to risk everything you've built just to take down one man? Even if you succeed, there's no guarantee it will feel like adequate compensation for what you've lost." "I'm not doing it for compensation," Dante replied, his voice carrying the kind of conviction that suggested he'd thought about this question extensively. "I'm doing it because your father's organization represents everything wrong with how power operates in criminal hierarchies: exploitation of the vulnerable, trafficking of innocent people, maintenance of authority through terror rather than legitimacy. Taking him down isn't just personal revenge. It's removing major source of suffering from the world. That's worth risking everything for. The idealism in his statement should have seemed naive coming from someone leading criminal organization, but Isabella found herself believing him because Dante's operations, from what she'd observed over the past weeks, were fundamentally different from her father's. He protected civilians rather than preying on them. He punished human traffickers rather than profiting from them. He'd built something that looked like actual community rather than simple hierarchy maintained through fear. "You're not what I expected," Isabella admitted, deciding that honesty was preferable to maintaining careful distance when they were already past the point of pretending this was simple protective arrangement. "When I agreed to come here, I assumed you'd be charming sociopath who'd eventually reveal exactly how manipulative he actually was. But you're genuinely trying to be better than the system you're operating in. That's rare. Possibly unique among people with your power level." "That's not a compliment I expected from Vincent Russo's daughter," Dante said, but his smile suggested he was pleased despite the deflection. "Though I should warn you, I'm still manipulative when circumstances require it, still willing to do terrible things to protect people I care about, still fundamentally shaped by violent world I grew up in. I'm not hero, Isabella. I'm just person who's trying very hard not to be villain." "That's still more than most people manage," Isabella replied, and found her hand reaching across the table to cover his before conscious thought could stop the gesture. "And for what it's worth, I think you're succeeding at the not being villain thing. Even if your methods are questionable and your revenge planning probably needs serious ethical review." The moment stretched between them, her hand on his, the air suddenly charged with something that went beyond simple attraction despite weeks of both of them carefully pretending the physical chemistry was irrelevant to their arrangement. Dante's thumb stroked across her knuckles with touch that was gentle enough to make her breath catch, his eyes holding hers with intensity that suggested he was processing multiple complicated emotions simultaneously. "We should probably discuss the elephant that's been sitting in this room for 2 weeks, Dante said finally, his voice dropping to register that made Isabella's pulse accelerate. "The fact that we're both extremely aware of how attracted we are to each other despite this starting as protective arrangement that should have remained professional. The fact that every conversation feels like foreplay. The fact that I'm spending considerable mental energy not acting on impulses that would definitely complicate our carefully negotiated boundaries." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Isabella lied, her voice coming out breathier than intended. "I've been perfectly professional. Any attraction you're sensing is clearly projection on your part." "You're a terrible liar," Dante replied, standing and moving around the table with predatory grace that made Isabella's heart hammer. "Your pupils dilate when I'm close. Your breath catches when I touch you. You've been watching me with expression that suggests you're mentally undressing me during at least 40% of our conversations. So we can either continue pretending this is purely professional arrangement, or we can acknowledge what's actually happening and discuss whether we're going to do anything about it." He was standing directly in front of her now, close enough that Isabella had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could feel heat radiating from his body despite not actually touching. "This is terrible idea," she managed even as her hands came up to rest against his chest. "We have power dynamic that makes consent complicated. We're in middle of situation that could get both of us killed. We barely know each other beyond context of revenge planning and protective arrangements. Every logical part of my brain is screaming that acting on this attraction would be catastrophically stupid." "Agreed," Dante murmured, his hands settling on her waist with touch that was possessive without being controlling. "Absolutely terrible idea. Potentially disastrous for multiple reasons. And yet, I'm still going to kiss you if you don't immediately tell me to stop. Because Isabella, you're the most fascinating person I've encountered in 5 years of living entirely for revenge, and I'm done pretending that protecting you is purely strategic when I'm actually falling for woman who waters her plants with expression of concentrated care." "That's such a weird reason to fall for someone," Isabella protested, but her hands were already sliding up to curl around his neck, already pulling him closer despite her verbal objections. "You need better standards for romantic interest. More conventional criteria. Like personality or shared interests or literally anything except plank care observation." "Too late," Dante replied, and then his mouth was on hers and Isabella stopped trying to articulate logical objections in favor of simply feeling. The kiss was everything she'd been trying not to imagine for 2 weeks. Intense and consuming and carrying the kind of desperate edge that suggested Dante had been fighting this just as hard as she had. His hands tightened on her waist, pulling her flush against him, and Isabella made sound that was probably embarrassing but she was too invested in the sensation of finally giving in to tension that had been building since their first encounter. They stumbled toward Dante's private quarters. Isabella had no clear memory of how they got there, just fragmented awareness of stairs and hallways and Dante's mouth never quite leaving hers even when logistics required brief separation. And by the time they reached his bedroom she was already mentally cataloging how many of her carefully constructed boundaries were about to be enthusiastically violated. "Last chance to change your mind," Dante said, his hands already working at the buttons of her shirt despite the theoretical off-ramp he was offering. "Because once we do this, once we cross this line, we're not going to be able to maintain comfortable fiction that this is purely professional protection arrangement. You become mine in ways that go beyond strategic alliance. And I become yours in ways that mean I'll burn down anyone who tries to hurt you. Are you sure that's territory you want to enter?" "Shut up and kiss me," Isabella replied, deciding that if she was going to make catastrophically poor decisions she might as well commit to them fully. "We can discuss complicated relationship implications after. Right now I just want—" She stopped, breath catching as Dante's mouth moved to her neck in ways that made coherent speech increasingly difficult. What followed was intense enough that Isabella understood why people wrote poetry about physical intimacy rather than simply describing mechanics. The connection transcended simple physical pleasure and became something closer to spiritual recognition that they'd been moving toward this moment since their first encounter. Dante was attentive and demanding in equal measure, his touch carrying the kind of focused intensity that suggested he approached everything in his life with similar commitment to excellence. And Isabella found herself responding with abandon she'd never quite accessed before because previous relationships had always carried the shadow of her father's disapproval. Afterward they lay tangled together while moonlight streamed through windows that probably cost more than Isabella's previous annual income, and she found herself laughing with the kind of relief that came from finally acknowledging something she'd been fighting. "What's funny?" Dante asked, his hand tracing idle patterns on her skin with touch that suggested he wasn't done exploring even if immediate physical urgency had been temporarily satisfied. "I was just thinking about how my father would react if he knew his estranged daughter was sleeping with his enemy," Isabella replied, her amusement tinged with darkness. "He'd probably consider it the ultimate betrayal. Proof that I'm not just rejecting his values but actively working against him. And somehow that makes this feel even more satisfying than it would have otherwise. Using me for rebellion against your father," Dante observed with mock hurt. "I'm wounded. I thought this was about my devastating charm and impressive physical attributes, but apparently I'm just convenient vehicle for working through family issues." "You're extremely convenient vehicle," Isabella agreed, rolling over to prop herself up on his chest. "Very well equipped for facilitating rebellion. 10 out of 10, would recommend for anyone looking to dramatically reject their father's approval." "That's still more than most people manage," Isabella replied, and found her hand reaching across the table to cover his before conscious thought could stop the gesture. "And for what it's worth, I think you're succeeding. At the not being villain thing. Even if your methods are questionable and your revenge planning probably needs serious ethical review." The moment stretched between them, her hand on his, the air suddenly charged with something that went beyond simple attraction despite weeks of both of them carefully pretending the physical chemistry was irrelevant to their arrangement. Dante's thumb stroked across her knuckles with touch that was gentle enough to make her breath catch, his eyes holding hers with intensity that suggested he was processing multiple complicated emotions simultaneously. "We should probably discuss the elephant that's been sitting in this room for 2 weeks, Dante said finally, his voice dropping to register that made Isabella's pulse accelerate. "The fact that we're both extremely aware of how attracted we are to each other despite this starting as protective arrangement that should have remained professional. The fact that every conversation feels like foreplay. The fact that I'm spending considerable mental energy not acting on impulses that would definitely complicate our carefully negotiated boundaries." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Isabella lied, her voice coming out breathier than intended. "I've been perfectly professional. Any attraction you're sensing is clearly projection on your part." "You're a terrible liar," Dante replied, standing and moving around the table with predatory grace that made Isabella's heart hammer. "Your pupils dilate when I'm close. Your breath catches when I touch you. You've been watching me with expression that suggests you're mentally undressing me during at least 40% of our conversations. So we can either continue pretending this is purely professional arrangement, or we can acknowledge what's actually happening and discuss whether we're going to do anything about it." He was standing directly in front of her now, close enough that Isabella had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could feel heat radiating from his body despite not actually touching. "This is terrible idea," she managed even as her hands came up to rest against his chest. "We have power dynamic that makes consent complicated. We're in middle of situation that could get both of us killed. We barely know each other beyond context of revenge planning and protective arrangements. Every logical part of my brain is screaming that acting on this attraction would be catastrophically stupid. Agreed, Dante murmured, his hands settling on her waist with touch that was possessive without being controlling. Absolutely terrible idea. Potentially disastrous for multiple reasons. And yet, I'm still going to kiss you if you don't immediately tell me to stop. Because Isabella, you're the most fascinating person I've encountered in 5 years of living entirely for revenge, and I'm done pretending that protecting you is purely strategic when I'm actually falling for woman who waters her plants with expression of concentrated care. That's such a weird reason to fall for someone, Isabella protested, but her hands were already sliding up to curl around his neck, already pulling him closer despite her verbal objections. You need better standards for romantic interest. More conventional criteria. Like personality or shared interests or literally anything except plank hair observation. Too late, Dante replied, and then his mouth was on hers and Isabella stopped trying to articulate logical objections in favor of simply feeling. The kiss was everything she'd been trying not to imagine for 2 weeks. Intense and consuming and carrying the kind of desperate edge that suggested Dante had been fighting this just as hard as she had. His hands tightened on her waist, pulling her flush against him, and Isabella made sound that was probably embarrassing, but she was too invested in the sensation of finally giving in to tension that had been building since their first encounter. They stumbled toward Dante's private quarters. Isabella had no clear memory of how they got there, just fragmented awareness of stairs and hallways and Dante's mouth never quite leaving hers even when logistics required brief separation. And by the time they reached his bedroom she was already mentally cataloging how many of her carefully constructed boundaries were about to be enthusiastically violated. Last chance to change your mind, Dante said, his hands already working at the buttons of her shirt despite the theoretical off-ramp he was offering. Because once we do this, once we cross this line, we're not going to be able to maintain comfortable fiction that this is purely professional protection arrangement. You become mine in ways that go beyond strategic alliance. And I become yours in ways that mean I'll burn down anyone who tries to hurt you. Are you sure that's territory you want to enter? Shut up and kiss me, Isabella replied, deciding that if she was going to make catastrophically poor decisions she might as well commit to them fully. We can discuss complicated relationship implications after. Right now I just want... She stopped, breath catching as Dante's mouth moved to her neck in ways that made coherent speech increasingly difficult. What followed was intense enough that Isabella understood why people wrote poetry about physical intimacy rather than simply describing mechanics. The connection transcended simple physical pleasure and became something closer to spiritual recognition that they'd been moving toward this moment since their first encounter. Dante was attentive and demanding in equal measure, his touch carrying the kind of focused intensity that suggested he approached everything in his life with similar commitment to excellence. And Isabella found herself responding with abandon she'd never quite accessed before because previous relationships had always carried the shadow of her father's disapproval. Afterward they lay tangled together while moonlight streamed through windows that probably cost more than Isabella's previous annual income, and she found herself laughing with the kind of relief that came from finally acknowledging something she'd been fighting. "What's funny?" Dante asked, his hand tracing idle patterns on her skin with touch that suggested he wasn't done exploring even if immediate physical urgency had been temporarily satisfied. "I was just thinking about how my father would react if he knew his estranged daughter was sleeping with his enemy," Isabella replied, her amusement tinged with darkness. "He'd probably consider it the ultimate betrayal. Proof that I'm not just rejecting his values but actively working against him. And somehow that makes this feel even more satisfying than it would have otherwise." "Using me for rebellion against your father?" Dante observed with mock hurt. "I'm wounded. I thought this was about my devastating charm and impressive physical attributes, but apparently I'm just convenient vehicle for working through family issues." "You're extremely convenient vehicle," Isabella agreed, rolling over to prop herself up on his chest. "Very well equipped for facilitating rebellion. 10 out of 10, would recommend for anyone looking to dramatically reject their father's approval." They might have continued the banter, might have spent the night exploring each other and postponing serious conversations about what this meant for their arrangement, if Dante's phone hadn't started ringing with the particular tone that apparently indicated emergency requiring immediate attention. "I should ignore that," Dante said, but he was already reaching for the device with the kind of automatic response that suggested he'd spent years being constantly available for crisis management. His expression shifted as he read the message. all humor draining away in favor of the dangerous focus that reminded Isabella exactly what kind of man she'd just been intimate with. "What's wrong?" Isabella asked, sitting up and pulling the sheet around herself with sudden awareness that whatever news he'd just received was serious enough to change the entire atmosphere. "Your father just bombed a public building," Dante replied, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was fighting very hard not to explode. "A shopping center in territory he's been trying to absorb. Civilian casualties are extensive, at least 20 dead, dozens more injured. He's claiming it was rival organization sending message, but my intelligence says the order came directly from Vincent. This wasn't business dispute. This was terrorism designed to intimidate everyone who's been resisting his expansion." The words hit Isabella like physical blows, her stomach clenching with a particular species of horror that came from being connected by blood to someone capable of such calculated evil. "How many dead?" she asked, her voice barely above whisper. 20 confirmed so far," Dante replied, already moving to get dressed with the efficient speed of someone preparing for war. "But the numbers are climbing. First responders are still pulling people from the rubble." "Isabella?" He turned to look at her directly. "I know he's your father. I know you left his organization specifically to avoid being complicit in this kind of violence. But this changes things. This level of civilian casualties, I can't let it go unanswered. I need to move against him now before he kills anyone else." "I'll help you," Isabella heard herself saying, the words emerging before conscious thought could stop them. "Whatever information you need about his organization, whatever intelligence about his operations, I'll provide it. Because Dante, you're right. This can't go unanswered. And if helping you means betraying the last vestiges of loyalty I might have felt to my father, then that's price I'm willing to pay to prevent more innocent people from dying." The decision was monumental, irrevocable, the kind of choice that would define the rest of Isabella's life regardless of how the confrontation with her father ultimately resolved. But watching the news footage Dante pulled up on his phone, the devastation, the bodies being carried from the rubble, the children crying for parents who would never answer, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that some betrayals were necessary. Some bridges needed burning. Some family ties deserved severing. Her father had crossed line that made neutrality impossible. And if Isabella had to help destroy him to prevent more atrocities, then that was exactly what she would do. The next 2 weeks were consumed by intensive planning and intelligence gathering, Isabella providing details about her father's operations that she'd absorbed despite trying very hard not to pay attention during her years in his house. Dante coordinating with allies who'd been waiting years for opportunity to move against Vincent Russo's organization. They worked together with the kind of focused intensity that came from shared purpose. And Isabella found herself falling deeper for a man who approached dismantling her father's empire with the same meticulous care he applied to everything else. "Your father has pattern," Dante explained one evening as they reviewed surveillance data. "Every major operation follows similar sequence. He establishes control through intimidation, consolidates through violence, maintains through fear. But he's also paranoid about betrayal, which means he keeps detailed records of everyone who's compromised. If we can access those records, if we can provide law enforcement with documented evidence of his trafficking operations and the terrorism he's committed, we can destroy him through legal system rather than requiring direct confrontation that would cost more lives." "He keeps the records in his primary estate," Isabella replied, her mind working through implications. "In a safe in his office. I know the code, he never changed it after I left because he never imagined I'd be stupid enough to come back and use that information against him. But Dante, the security at his estate is extensive. Getting in and out without being detected would require more than just knowledge of safe combination." "I can get you in," Dante said with confidence that was either well-founded or dangerously optimistic. "I have people on his security staff who are ready to cooperate once we give them reason to believe betrayal will be profitable. But Isabella, this is a decision you need to make very carefully. Once you cross this line, once you actively help take down your father, there's no returning to neutrality. He'll know you were involved. He'll consider you enemy rather than wayward daughter. Are you certain that's choice you want to make?" "I'm certain," Isabella replied without hesitation. "I left his organization because I didn't want to be complicit in his violence. But leaving wasn't enough. Not when he's still killing innocent people, still trafficking humans, still representing everything wrong with criminal power structures. If I can help stop him, if I can provide evidence that puts him in prison for the rest of his life, then that's redemption for 26 years of benefiting from blood money. That's how I become someone other than Vincent Russo's daughter." The operation was planned with military precision, Dante's people coordinating with law enforcement agents who'd been trying unsuccessfully for years to build case against Vincent Russo that would actually hold up in court. Isabella would access the safe, photograph the documents with device Dante provided, and transmit everything to secure servers before extracting with Dante's team. Simple in concept. Catastrophically dangerous in execution. They moved 2 nights later, Isabella's hands steady despite terror making her heart race as she approached her father's estate for first time in 3 years. The security had been compromised exactly as Dante promised, the guards looking away at crucial moments, the cameras mysteriously malfunctioning during window they needed. She made it to her father's office without incident, her muscle memory guiding her through house she'd grown up in despite years of deliberately forgetting the layout. The safe opened easily with code she'd memorized at age 12, her father's anniversary date, which was either sentimental or simply convenient for his terrible memory. Inside were documents that confirmed everything Dante had suspected and considerably more. Detailed records of trafficking operations, evidence of the bombing that had killed 20 civilians, names of law enforcement officials who'd been bribed or blackmailed into cooperation. It was a comprehensive map of criminal empire, carefully documented by man who'd never imagined his own daughter would use it against him. Isabella photographed everything with shaking hands, her phone transmitting images to Dante's servers in real time in case something went wrong before extraction. She was replacing the final document when her father's voice spoke from the doorway with tone that suggested he'd been watching her entire time. "Hello, Isabella," Vincent said calmly, his expression holding mixture of disappointment and calculation. "I wondered if you'd eventually come back. Though I admit I didn't expect it would be to steal from me. That seems unnecessarily dramatic even for your typically excessive displays of rejection." Isabella turned to face the man who'd raised her and destroyed countless lives, her fear crystallizing into fury that made her voice steady despite the danger. "I'm not stealing," she replied flatly. "I'm collecting evidence. For the law enforcement officials who are about to arrest you for terrorism, trafficking, and approximately 40 other crimes you've committed over the past decade. You're done, Dad. Your empire ends tonight." Vincent laughed. Actually laughed like the entire situation was amusing rather than catastrophic to everything he'd built. "You think you're the first person to try taking me down through legal system? I own half the judges in this state. I have enough leverage on law enforcement officials that they'll bury any evidence you provide before it reaches trial. You're naive, Isabella. Idealistic and naive. Just like your mother before the world taught her that principles are luxury weak people can't afford." "Maybe," Isabella agreed, backing toward the window where Dante's extraction team was waiting. "But at least I'm trying. At least I'm not murdering innocent people to maintain power I don't deserve. And Dad," her voice dropped, "you should know that I'm not working alone. Dante Caruso sends his regards. He's been very interested in your operations since you destroyed his family. Turns out sleeping with your enemy's daughter is remarkably effective intelligence-gathering strategy." She had one moment to register Vincent's expression shifting from amusement to genuine rage before she was diving through the window, Dante's people catching her and moving immediately toward extraction vehicle. Bullets shattered glass behind her, Vincent's security finally engaging now that the situation had escalated beyond simple family drama, but Dante's team was better trained and better prepared and they reached the vehicles without casualties. "Did you get everything?" Dante demanded the moment Isabella was secure in the SUV, his hands checking her for injuries despite her assurances that she was unharmed. "Everything," Isabella confirmed, her adrenaline finally fading enough to allow shaking that she couldn't quite control. "Documented evidence of every crime he's committed for the past 10 years. And Dante, I told him. About us. About you. About everything. He knows I betrayed him. He knows I chose you over family loyalty. There's no going back now." "Good," Dante replied, pulling her close with the kind of possessive relief that suggested he'd been considerably more worried about the operation than he'd admitted. "Because Isabella, you're mine now. Permanently. Not as prisoner or protected witness or convenient intelligence source. As my partner. My equal. The woman I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of. Are you okay with that?" "I'm okay with that," Isabella replied, allowing herself to finally relax against his chest. "Though you should know, being with me means inheriting enemy who will spend every remaining moment of his life trying to destroy us both. My father doesn't forgive betrayal. Ever. We've just started war that probably won't end until one of us is dead." "Worth it," Dante said simply, and kissed her with the kind of intensity that suggested he meant exactly what he was saying. The following week was chaos as law enforcement officials processed the evidence Isabella had provided, The media exploded with revelations about Vincent Russo's criminal empire, and prosecutors began building case that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in maximum security prison. Isabella testified at grand jury hearing, her words careful but damning, her presence representing ultimate betrayal for man who'd valued family loyalty above every other virtue. Vincent was arrested at his estate, the images broadcast across every news channel showing him being led away in handcuffs while his organization collapsed around him without his leadership to maintain its structure. The trafficking operations were shut down, the victims rescued, the corrupt officials exposed and prosecuted alongside the man who'd been controlling them. It was justice in the most complete form Isabella had ever witnessed, redemption for years of benefiting from blood money, vindication that sometimes doing the right thing actually led to right outcomes rather than simply punishing everyone involved. 3 months later, standing in front of judge who'd agreed to conduct the ceremony in Dante's private estate, Isabella reflected on exactly how dramatically her life had changed since the day she'd decided bringing pot roast to a mysterious neighbor was reasonable suburban behavior. She'd expected quiet anonymity, fresh start, distance from criminal world she'd been trying to escape. What she'd gotten instead was dangerous man who'd been surveilling her, protective arrangement that became genuine partnership, an active role in taking down the most powerful criminal organization in 6 states. Also, apparently, marriage proposal from said dangerous man who'd somehow convinced her that spending the rest of their lives together was excellent idea despite every logical reason suggesting otherwise. "You can still back out," Dante murmured as they stood waiting for ceremony to begin. "I promise I won't take it personally if you suddenly realize marrying person you met during protective arrangement is questionable judgment even by your notably flexible standards." "Too late," Isabella replied, squeezing his hand. "I already committed to being person who destroyed her father's empire and rebuilt her life with his enemy. Walking away from the wedding at this point would be anticlimactic. Plus," she looked up at him with expression that held genuine affection alongside amusement, "you're surprisingly good company for dangerous criminal with revenge obsession. I've grown attached to your questionable judgment and impressive physical attributes." "That's basically love declaration," Dante said, his smile suggesting he was joking but his eyes holding something considerably more serious. "I'll take it. Though for the record, you're significantly more than convenient rebellion vehicle. You're the person who reminded me why justice matters more than revenge. The woman who proved that some people are worth protecting even when it complicates carefully constructed plans. The partner I want beside me while we build something better than the corrupt system we both grew up in. That's love, Isabella. Even if it started with really terrible surveillance choices and escalated through ethically questionable protective arrangements." The ceremony was simple and private, attended only by people who'd helped them survive the confrontation with Vincent's organization and understood exactly how complicated their relationship actually was. When the judge pronounced them married, when Dante kissed her with the kind of intensity that suggested he intended to spend considerable time celebrating later, Isabella felt something settle in her chest that she'd been missing her entire life. Genuine safety that came from being with someone who valued her for who she was rather than what family she'd been born into. She was no longer Vincent Russo's daughter. She was Isabella Caruso, wife to dangerous man who'd been willing to abandon revenge plans when they conflicted with protecting innocent people. Partner in building criminal organization that operated on principles rather than simple exploitation. Woman who'd chosen love and justice over family loyalty and comfortable neutrality. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she'd moved to quiet suburban neighborhood seeking fresh start. But it was considerably more interesting. And if interesting meant dangerous and complicated and occasionally required testifying against your own father, well, Isabella had never been very good at accepting what she was supposed to accept anyway. At least now she was being problematic with someone who appreciated her inability to follow rules and her tendency to threaten people with dinner knives when they said unreasonable things. That had to count as successful marriage by any reasonable standard. Immerse yourself in more dangerous romance. If the house that watched left your heart racing and craving more intense Mafia love stories, subscribe for weekly dark romance stories filled with power, obsession, betrayal, and devotion. Like this video if you enjoy enemies to lovers and morally gray heroes. Comment below, would you have betrayed your own blood for love and justice? Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of passion, danger, and forbidden desire. Because some love stories aren't safe. They're worth the risk.